Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Dr. Marta Cerezo. She is a professor of English. She's a medievalist and a Shakespearean scholar. She teaches at the National University of Distance Education in Spain, the UNED in Madrid. And she's devoted to Shakespeare and religion, most especially to Shakespeare commemorative sermons delivered at Holy Trinity Church, Stratford-upon-Avon, since the 19th century. She is the chief editor of Sederi Yearbook, a journal of Spanish and of the Spanish and Portuguese Society of English Renaissance Studies. She is also the director of a research group of English Literary Studies and the principal researcher of a research project, Shakespeare's Religious Afterlives, Text, Reception, and Performance, which is funded by the Spanish ministry. And today, her lecture is titled "'Tis Universal Like the Air of Heaven, Reflections on Shakespeare as a Universal Author." Marta, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, I would like, first of all, to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Viorica Patea for inviting me to deliver this lecture. It is both an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you and to share the following hour with the students of the Master and the PhD program in Advanced English Studies, Languages and Cultures in Contact. My talk today is framed within the research project Shakespeare's Religious Afterlives, Text, Reception and Performance, funded by the Ministry of Science and Innovation and the European Union. The Chakrel project participates in the turn to religion experienced by Shakespearean scholarship in the last few decades by pioneering a little explored field of research within the area of Shakespeare studies. That is the playwright's religious afterlives. And by Shakespeare's religious afterlives, we mean critical interpretations, translations, editions, theatrical, film, or narrative adaptations, and creative productions and recreations of any kind related to Shakespeare's works, which are mainly based on, influenced by, or in conversation with religious discourses. The mission of our project of Chakrel is to stake a claim for Shakespeare's religious afterlives as a field of research in its own right, and to demonstrate its critical relevance to a more comprehensive understanding of the history and present of Shakespeare's universal cultural dominance in a constant process of meaning generation and value creation. Throughout our years of research in this project, we have observed that the different religious afterlives that we have been analyzing, it reflects a common idea of Shakespeare as a universal author that departs from the conservative interpretation of the concept universal Shakespeare. Here you can see the list of contributors of a volume that will be published by the end of this year. Most of the contributors are members of Chakrel, some others are collaborators. The title is The Universal Shakespeare Creed. And we argue about certain things that I will be defending today in my presentation. Since the 18th century, the notion of Shakespeare's universality has been linked to the idea that his plays articulate with unparalleled eloquence and dramatic force timeless truths about the universal human condition, truths that endure throughout the ages and appeal equally across the world, regardless of nationality, of creed, race, sexual orientation, or language. This notion of universal Shakespeare has sparked numerous and controversial scholarly debates, and it has been considered a reactionary concept of universalism that connects the author's universality with Western linguistic and cultural hegemony and imperial and colonial cultural superiority. The aim of my presentation today is to dismantle the correspondence between universality in Shakespeare and authoritarian cultural dominance, and instead, I propose that the term universal Shakespeare points to the author's ability to evoke ethical spaces of democratic encounter, social cohesion, and communion. I will argue during my presentation that the connection between religiosity and Shakespeare commemoration contributes to the gradual collective construction of this ethical and democratic interpretation of the playwright as a universal author. My presentation will be divided in 4 different parts. The first one is this introduction. The second one will be called the controversy, and I will be dealing with the controversy around the notion of Shakespeare as a universal author. The third part is called the making of a concept, and in order to illustrate how the connection between religiosity and Shakespeare commemoration contributes to the gradual collective construction of this ethical and democratic interpretation of the playwright as a universal author, I will go back to the 19th century Shakespeare commemorative acts in Stratford-upon-Avon. To defend my argument, I will follow Anne Rigney and Job Lerson as I envision the acts of commemorations as they do, as cultural practices with their own agency, that is, with the power to produce effects and transform social relations. I will analyze in this third part of my presentation some of the associations between Shakespeare's work and religious discourse made during the annual commemorative events led by the Royal Shakespearean Club in Stratford-upon-Avon in the mid-19th century, a period when the concept of Shakespeare universality is deployed with strong emphasis. The exploration of these 19th century references to Shakespeare universality will reveal that spirituality was often established as one of the fundamental elements at the heart of this concept, of the concept of Shakespeare as a universal author. And the fourth part of my presentation is called the celebration. And I will give you, in the last minutes of my presentation, an example of a very recent Shakespeare's religious afterlife that the team of our project of Chakrel has celebrated, and that illustrates what Shakespeare as a universal author means to us. We are still in the introductory part of my presentation, and I will now give you the first example of this association between Shakespeare universality, commemoration, and religion that I was talking about before. And I would like you to pay attention to the title of my presentation. "'Tis universal like the air of heaven, reflections on Shakespeare as a universal author." The first part of the title of my talk, "'Tis universal like the air of heaven," is an incomplete quotation. The full quotation reads as follows: "'Tis universal like the air of heaven, which cometh we know not where, and goeth we know not whither, but its influence is seen and felt in everything that lives and breathes." This quotation refers to Shakespeare as a universal author, and it was stated by Mr. Bass, who was manager of the Warwick Theatre during the annual commemorative dinner led by the Royal Shakespearean Club as part of the Shakespeare birthday celebrations every April in Stratford-upon-Avon. Those Shakespeare commemorative celebrations started with the 1769 Shakespeare Jubilee, and they are still celebrated today. The Shakespeare Club was a society founded in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1824 to celebrate the life and works of William Shakespeare. Its members, who were often local literary enthusiasts and admirers of Shakespeare, met to discuss his plays, organize readings, and honor his legacy. The Shakespeare Club of Stratford-upon-Avon received royal patronage in 1830, when King George IV officially authorized it to be called the Royal Shakespearean Club. This royal recognition reflected the early success and popularity of the club in celebrating Shakespeare and organizing major festivities in Stratford-upon-Avon. The Shakespeare Club annual commemorative dinner took place at the Shakespeare Hall, which was the assembly room on the first floor of the town hall that you can see here in this photograph. On this occasion, during the 1839 annual commemorative dinner, Mr. Bass offered a toast to the memory of Shakespeare. Mr. Bass then addressed the other members of the club, saying, I entered this room, he was referring to the Shakespeare Hall, to that assembly room, but as a pilgrim to the shrine of Shakespeare. I confess I rise with feelings of pride in being honored with the opportunity of making the attempt on this, the anniversary of the sweet bard of Avon, and amid a circle who are assembled to testify their admiration and reverence of the great spirit, whose mighty genius, rising from the obscurity of humble birth and station, burst the thrall which bound him, and shone above the stars which spangled the literary hemisphere, not merely as a superior planet, but as the resplendent sun, before whose rays the lesser luminaries were all eclipsed, while he gave life and being to a world. Nor was the gentle Shakespeare alone the son of the then literary world. Succeeding ages have passed away. Knowledge has progressed. Science and learning have advanced with rapid strides. New worlds have been discovered. Men of talent and genius have arisen, who have been worthy of the admiration of society. But still, the genius of Shakespeare stands supreme and unapproachable. 'Tis universal, like the air of heaven, which cometh we know not where, and goeth we know not whither, but its influence is seen and felt in everything that lives and breathes. Mr. Bass describes himself, as you can see, as we've read, as entering the room, the Shakespeare Hall, as a pilgrim to the shrine of Shakespeare, and states that the purpose of all those present in the room is to show reverence, to worship the great spirit. In the 19th century, Shakespeare was viewed as the national poet from Stratford-upon-Avon, which was described in the same terms that actor David Garrick used to depict it in the 1769 Shakespeare Jubilee as a place of pilgrimage, as a shrine where the memory of the literary god, Shakespeare, must be praised. The origin of Shakespeare's sacralization dates back to the 17th century, and it is during the Garrick Jubilee that it reaches its highest point. This sense of religiosity, imbricated with a strong sense of national pride, underpinned the Stratford Shakespeare commemorative events. So it is not surprising at all that Mr. Bass tried to dress up his toast with religious references. The idea that despite all progress, Shakespeare's genius remains unmatched and unsurpassed, and that his influence is felt everywhere, was accompanied, as we've seen, by the quotation, "'Tis universal like the air of heaven, which cometh we know not where, and goeth we know not whither." Bass's words are inspired by John's Gospel, chapter 3, verse 8. "The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh, and whither it goeth." These words are spoken by Jesus in his conversation with Nicodemus, recorded in chapter 3 of John's Gospel. Nicodemus, a Pharisee and member of the Jewish ruling council, comes to Jesus at night. Jesus tells him that no one can see or enter the kingdom of God without being born again, meaning a spiritual rebirth through the Spirit. Nicodemus struggles to understand And Jesus teaches that God sent his Son so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. Jesus then says to Nicodemus, "The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth." What Jesus' words mean is that the work of the Holy Spirit, like the wind, is mysterious and beyond human control or understanding. Just as we can feel the wind and hear its sounds, but cannot fully trace its origin or destination, the Spirit moves freely in people's hearts, bringing spiritual life, transformation, and guidance in ways we cannot predict. Belief in Jesus opens us to this spiritual movement. Mr. Bass's identification of the universality of Shakespeare with the air of heaven, which cometh we not know where and goeth we not know whither, but his influence is seen and felt in everything that lives and breathes, acquires full meaning when read in the light of John's Gospel. The reasons of Shakespeare's universality are beyond our understanding. That was what Bass was telling his audience. But the author's influence pervades everything, like the wind. It blows where it wants, in unpredicted directions. And whereas the Holy Spirit provokes our spiritual rebirth, the force of Shakespeare's work brings about a cathartic transformation in his audience or readers. Just as the wind, just as the Holy Spirit blows freely and its path is unseen, Shakespeare's ever-expanding influence across the globe works mysteriously. We see its effects even if we don't fully understand it. Mr. Bass's 19th century insight about the inscrutability of Shakespeare's universality resonates powerfully today. Numerous attempts have been made to explain the author's global appeal. However, there is no single answer, and it is not the aim of this lecture to solve this enigma. Scholars specializing in the author's work have recognized this difficulty. I will mention three figures which will be central during my talk, and they have openly expressed this. For example, Andrew Dixon and Kiernan Ryan have both expressed that the reason that led them to write their books was elsewhere, Journeys Around Shakespeare's Globe, and Shakespeare's Universality, was the need to give a coherent explanation to Shakespeare as a global phenomenon. Dominic Dromgoole, artistic director of the Globe Theatre in London for 10 years, and who led the Globe to Globe Hamlet, which was a 2-year world tour from 2014 to 2016, wrote an extraordinary and inspiring article in The Guardian after the tour called "Shakespeare, the Playwright Who Brings the World Closer." And this article served as his farewell message as the Globe's artistic director. In this article, Dromgoole stated the following: "How Shakespeare occupies this unique position in the world remains an unfathomable and delightful mystery. The worldwide tour we are about to complete would have been impossible to achieve with any other playwright or with any other work of art. But the name Hamlet, the words to be or not to be, with all their gravity defines simplicity, and the image of a young man looking into a skull in a state of wonderment are now all part of the cultural language by which we attempt to understand ourselves and each other." The universal global nature of Shakespeare's work that Dromgoole evokes here as a space of mutual understanding is far from the consideration of the notion of universal Shakespeare as a reactionary idea that leads to cultural imposition. With that in mind, let us now turn to the second part of our discussion called the controversy. This second part deals with the controversy around the notion of Shakespeare as a universal author. And I will go on talking about this concept in relation to the connection between Shakespeare, religion, and commemoration. But this time, in order to deal with universal Shakespeare as a controversial issue, and before returning to the 19th century Shakespeare celebrations to see how the notion of universal Shakespeare took shape, I will focus on a significant example of Shakespeare's religious afterlife, which occurred at the Vatican in 2016. The Globe-to-Globe Hamlet, from April the 23rd, 2014 to April the 23rd, 2016, traveled to almost every single country in the world to mark the 450th anniversary of William Shakespeare's birth, and performed in a wide array of settings to reach even those in poor and conflicted regions. Here you can see Hamlet played in the Satari refugee camp in Jordan, or at the Jungle refugee camp in Calais. On April the 13th, 2016, the Globe-to-Globe World Tour production of Hamlet, after having traveled to 190 countries, was performed at the Vatican as part of the commemorative events of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. As Bishop Paul Tide, who was the adjunct secretary of the Pontifical Council for Culture at the time, the organization that organized the whole event, as I said, Bishop Paul Tide explains, Shakespeare's Globe approached, he said, the Holy See about the possibility of finding a venue and the possibility of putting on Hamlet. There was immediately a very warm response here to the initiative, he said. The Globe-to-Globe performance of Hamlet in the Vatican was primarily and interestingly welcomed as an appropriate event within the very particular context of the Holy Year of Mercy. That God's mercy was infinite and that the compassionate recognition of the other must guide human lives were the principal messages of the Pope and the Vatican in 2016. The 2016 Catholic discourses interpreted Shakespeare as a theatrical spiritual force that builds bridges between people and that evokes an ecumenical sense of reconciliation and forgiveness through plays like The Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, for example, which unambiguously present mercy as one of their central themes. What is most striking and interesting here is the fact that Hamlet was perceived not just as a play of retaliation, but paradoxical as it may sound, it was perceived at the Vatican as a play of mercy. The prayers seen in Hamlet, when Hamlet hesitates to kill his uncle Claudius while he is praying, fearing that killing him during prayer would send his soul to heaven, and the closet scene in Hamlet when Hamlet confronts his mother Gertrude, revokes her for marrying Claudius, and accidentally kills Polonius hiding behind the arras, both scenes evoked in the Vatican the need of the sacrament of confession, and therefore repentance to achieve God's mercy and truthful compassion. The play's focus on revenge was read in the Holy See as a warning of the dangers of creating a world without mercy, where justice is only understood in terms of vengeance. Hamlet was considered an anti-revenge play that shows the uselessness of violence and the need to conciliate justice and mercy. However, not all responses to the tour were as positive as the Vatican's, that saw in the universality of Hamlet a way of preaching for peace, mercy, and compassion. The Globe-to-Globe Hamlet attracted its measure of controversy. For example, the Globe Theatre Company was attacked for intending to visit North Korea. Madison Park, in an article called Globe Theatre Defenses World Tour, including North Korea, explained how the decision of the Globe Theatre to perform Hamlet in North Korea in 2015 sparked criticism, especially from human rights groups, because of parallels between the play's plot about a prince killing his uncle and North Korea leader Kim Jong-un's execution of his uncle, Jang Song-taek. Amnesty International strongly criticized the visit, pointing to North Korea's severe human rights abuses documented in the UN report. Therefore, the universality of Shakespeare was, in this case, brought very much into question. However, the Globe defended its decision, arguing that cultural exchange promotes dialogue and inclusion. The theatre, the Globe, maintained that art should be accessible everywhere and described Shakespeare as a force for good. Niall Cooper from Amnesty International responded that the moral themes of Hamlet were unlikely to influence North Korea's leadership, and in fact, Kim Jong-un's regime finally refused to allow them in. Artistic director Dominic Drumgold's project was also accused of cultural imperialism. What was considered as Shakespeare's universalism by the Globe-to-Globe Hamlet was equated with cultural hegemony by Andrew Dixon in his article or review, Hamlet, Globe-to-Globe, by Dominic Drumgold Review, Neo-Colonial Folly. Drumgold's lack of interest in the way different cultures have already largely interpreted and translated Shakespeare was emphasized by Dixon, who remarked how the director failed to explain how non-Anglophone audiences, many with long-standing traditions of their own of staging Hamlet in translation, engaged with an English language production, or what kind of cross-cultural conversation the experiment provoked. Dixon writes, sending a British company on a world tour with the British Empire's favorite playwright might come across as a touch neo-colonial, especially given they play in Jacobean English, usually without subtitles, and do not collaborate with local companies. In Hamlet, Globe to Globe, Drumgold defended himself from these accusations and stressed the existence of cross-cultural conversations during the two-year tour. Hamlet, he said, was chosen for its elusive, Protean, and mysterious nature, which allowed it to be received by disparate cultures. In Shakespeare's universality, Kiernan Ryan points to another illustrative example of the way the notion universal Shakespeare has been identified with cultural imperialism. Ryan discusses the controversy sparked by Emma O'Toole in 2012 in an article in The Guardian called Shakespeare, Universal? No, it's cultural imperialism. O'Toole argues that Shakespeare's supposed universality is not evidence of timeless artistic truth, but a legacy of British colonialism. She maintained that what makes Shakespeare compelling today often lies in modern reinterpretations rather than in the texts themselves, which contain classist, sexist, and racist elements, as seen in plays like The Taming of the Shrew and The Merchant of Venice. From this perspective, Shakespeare's global prominence was spread by the British Empire as a symbol of cultural superiority. 447 readers responded to her article, many of them with well-reasoned arguments defending the view that what the author considered cultural imperialism was in fact cultural exchange. Since the 18th century, Shakespeare's universality has been linked to the belief that his plays express timeless truths about the human condition. However, over the past 4 decades, as we are seeing, many scholars have rejected this idea, emphasizing that his works are products of their historical moment, and that the myth of Shakespeare as a universal author has supported imperial, patriarchal, and hierarchical ideologies. Kiernan Ryan argues that this critique, while valuable, goes too far. Although Shakespeare must be understood in his historical context, his enduring global influence still requires explanation. According to Ryan, what is truly universal in Shakespeare is not the specific experiences of his characters or abstract eternal truths, but the dramatic perspective from which those experiences are portrayed. While his fictional worlds reflect the inequalities and prejudices of the Renaissance, they are structured, according to Ryan, in ways that reveal the shared humanity of all people. He says, but he, Shakespeare, dramatizes that early modern reality in such a way as to reveal the potential it harbors for transformation, the potential of human beings, then and now, to base their lives together on values that possess universal validity, because they are founded on the simple, irrefutable fact that we belong to the same species. Ryan illustrates this through Shylock's speech in The Merchant of Venice, which exposes the systemic racism of Shakespeare's time, also articulating egalitarian moral principles. Drawing on the Romantic critic William Hazlitt, Ryan describes this as the revolutionary, he calls it revolutionary, dimension of Shakespeare's universality. That is, his ability to give voice to kings and beggars, to rulers and subjects, to men and women, without privileging a single viewpoint. This multivocal imagination creates a common human perspective that challenges hierarchy and helps explain the lasting power of Shakespeare's drama. In Hazlitt, Ryan finds the most fundamental aspect of the revolutionary nature of Shakespeare's universality, the profoundly democratic thrust of Shakespeare's dramatic imagination, that is, his capacity for communication with all other minds. Hazlitt's democratic perception of Shakespeare's universality in the 19th century brings me to the third part of my talk that illustrates how this leveling and egalitarian spirit that Hazlitt and Ryan perceive in Shakespeare, and not cultural dominance or colonialism, was central, already central, to the development of the idea of Shakespeare as a universal author during the 19th century in the context of the Shakespeare commemorative events in Stratford-upon-Avon, and also in connection with the religious aura that surrounded everything related to the author at the time. Given the limits of time, I will concentrate just on a single, specially telling example that will allow me to illustrate my argument. In 1846, after the annual meeting of the Royal Shakespeare Club, a grand concert of sacred music took place in Shakespeare's church, which is the Holy Trinity Church of Stratford-upon-Avon. This grand concert was in honor of the author. The concert was attended by around 900 people. The bearer's Worcester Journal covered all the particulars of the concert, which was very well received. However, the newspaper pointed out that despite the scale of this year's commemorative events, they only managed to attract the interest of visitors from the surrounding areas of Stratford. The main purpose of this report was to encourage the British public from all classes to show greater support for the Shakespeare's Club's commemorative festivities in the town in the following years. Behind this report's rationale, there was an idea of universality marked by a basic avoidance of doctrines that could result in sectarian divisions and social conflict. The journal presents Shakespeare as an author that wrote for the world and not for a party. He was not of an age, but for all time. The journal at this point was alluding to Ben Jonson's famous verse in his poem for the first folio. That verse read, "He was not of an age, but for all time." And the journal continues, "And never was the universality of his works more appreciated than at the present. They are perused with equal pleasure by all classes, being untainted by the pernicious influences of controversial doctrines or the mutual persecution of rival sects. Although he lived in an age of religious enthusiasm, his mind, Shakespeare's mind, soared far above the bitterness of party fanaticism, and he speaks with the greatest veneration of wise men of all denominations, or by whatever name designated." It is hard not to think that these lines might be referring to the religious tensions that arose during those years in the 19th century with the Catholic revival of the Oxford movement and the surge of the more liberal stance of the broad church and Christian socialism, which opposed both the high church and the evangelical wing and faced the problem of social inequalities through fellowship and a sense of Christian communion. Conflicts also arose due to nonconformist activism, and it was precisely in 1846 when the Religious Disabilities Act, repealing civil restrictions on Catholics, Jews, and Protestant dissenters, was passed. The Paris Worcester Journal viewed Shakespeare, as I read before, as far above the bitterness of party fanaticism and as able to reach every man and every woman, irrespective of their denominations or name designated. And I repeat the quotation because it's quite telling. Shakespeare festivities are described in the journal as a unique occasion, as you can read here, of rare occurrence in the present age, permitting all to withdraw for a while from the arena of political and religious contention and commingle heart and hand at Shakespeare's shrine. The author is then pictured as a kind of alternative secular religion whose welcoming nature and neutrality invited everyone, without distinction, to participate in the celebrations. Following the performance at the church, following the grand concert, the annual 1846 Royal Shakespearean Club's dinner took place at the Shakespeare Hall, and the dinner was chaired by lawyer and agricultural writer Chandos Wren Hoskins. Hoskins' speech during the dinner was greatly influenced by German philosopher Hermann Ulrichi and his poetical conception in Shakespeare's dramatic art and his relation to Calderon and Goethe. This book was first published in 1839, and it was translated into English in 1846, the year that Hoskins was delivering the speech during the Royal Shakespearean Club's dinner. The concepts of universality, eternity, and spirituality mingle at the base of Ulrichi and Hoskins' arguments. In his speech, Hoskins lamented the fact that despite the technological advances of the time, which in themselves demonstrated the progress of the human mind, there was still no clear understanding of the fundamental role that poetry, drama, and imagination played in society. This, he argued, was due to a misconception of poetry's true meaning. To Hoskins, poetry is the reflection of a timeless nature and in close alliance with religion. And it was the intention, you can read the quotation here, it was the intention of the deity that imagination should spread over the world as a mirror, as a polished mirror in which the glorious works of creation were intended to reflect themselves. Poetry revealed to Hoskins one broad mantle of beauty that one can find over the whole of God's creation and that appeals to every sense of man. Shakespeare was for him the poet who most masterfully revealed this spiritual beauty, which teaches us, he said, that happiness to man is not confined to the mere objects of sense, and that in nature there is a unity of design, a unity of purpose. If we look at Shakespeare, he said, this is also in the slide, we shall find there is no distorted perception of nature in any of his faces, that he is evidently the poet of nature and therefore of eternity. Hoskins clarified that by being the poet of nature, Shakespeare not only takes us with him into the fields expanded with animate nature, but has opened the intricate labyrinths of the human mind. Hoskins' poetical disquisition follows Ulrichi closely, especially when he borrows the German author's definition of Shakespeare's conception of drama as the poetical delineation of the history of the world, as a reflection of the world around us, in order to lead the world to a knowledge of itself and man by it to a full understanding of his nature and destination. Hoskins' quotation from Ulrizi stops here in his speech in the Shakespeare Hall. But the German author develops his argument by stating that what is really essential in drama is that it reveals to man the true purpose of human existence, the right ways to attain it, and the mental development and the successive degrees of human improvement throughout history necessary to reach that objective. It is in this sense, Ulrichi stated, that Shakespeare shows us that the true object matter, consequently of dramatic representation, is the history of the world. And this is a quotation from Hamlet. Its end is to cooperate in effecting the end of that history, which is the recognition of man as the fundamental condition of all true knowledge, as well as the acknowledgement of God as the sum of all truth. Ulrizi's definition of the object of both drama and the history of the world carries within it the idea of universality. Underlying Hoskins' speech is Ulrizi's perception of the universal spirit of art, which finds its twofold starting point in a poetic idea that evolves from the observation of what Hoskins calls an eternal nature, and in the artist, who serves, he said, the artist serves as the substratum and mechanism with which the eternal idea, the immutable mind of art, combines itself for its temporary realization. Out of this combination arises a new life and a special form of the universal spirit of art, in which the human, the individual, and the perishable are fused together with the ever-enduring vitality of the idea into organic unity, which consequently is the expression, no doubt, of individual character, but also at the same time, the living portraiture and realization of the universal essence of art. For both Ulrizi and Hoskins, Shakespeare stands as the ultimate embodiment of their perception of the universal essence of art, which, though marked by clear religious undertones, already presents the three main traits of what Kiernan Ryan calls the revolutionary nature of Shakespeare's universality, and which was very much inspired by Hazlitt, as we saw before. First, Shakespearean drama is capable of showing the utopian potential inherent to humanity, but as yet unfulfilled. Both Ulrizi and Kiernan Ryan share this thought. Kiernan considers that Shakespeare's drama foreshadows a transfigured future. Ulrizi defines this capacity of Shakespeare's drama as Shakespeare's art's temporary realization, which means that Shakespeare is evoking the mental development and the successive degrees of human improvement. The second thought that they both share is that according to Ryan, despite the powerful dramatization of his own world, Shakespeare's evocation of humans' transformative potential implies a positive future evolution with respect to the mindset of the author's age, that is, a transcendence of his own time. To Ryan, Shakespeare captures the soul of the age in his plays in a way that transcends his age, because he writes about his age from an imaginative perspective that is always ahead of his time, not confined to it. And to Ulrizi, transcendence of the author's time is also part of his work's greatness. He says, the greater an author is, the more independent will he be of all the particular and narrow interests, ideas, and tendencies of his age and country, and the higher will he soar above the special and existent development of his art. And the third idea that they both share is that this transcendence is democratic and points to the universality of an author who is ahead of his time and who, Ulrizi states, is able to stand above every special grade of the progress of art. He belongs to all times and to all people. For Ryan, Shakespeare depicts his age in such a way, and I've read this quotation before, but I think it is important to read again. In such a way, Shakespeare depicts his age in such a way as to reveal the potential it harbors for transformation, the potential of human beings, then and now, to base their lives together on values that possess universal validity, because they are founded on the simple, irrefutable fact that we belong to the same species. Ryan's view is political insofar as Shakespeare's plays are committed to the emancipation of humanity. They reveal the potential of all human beings to live according to principles of freedom, equality, and justice. Ulrichi and Hoskins, however, understand this universal validity in religious terms. To them, Shakespeare's poetic idea becomes eternal, immutable, ever-enduring, that is, universal, as it intends to show not just man as the fundamental condition of all true knowledge, but God as the sum of all truth. Hoskins' vigorous defense of Shakespeare's poetry as a spiritual universal act is strengthened at the end of his speech in 1846 through his appropriation of American divine and philanthropist William Ellery Channing's reflection on literature in his book Self-Cultured, published in 1838. For him, literature was the spiritual presence of the best and greatest of our race, whose voices express the spiritual life of past ages, which is made accessible to everyone. Books, states Channing, are the true levelers. No matter how poor we are, no matter though the prosperous of my own time will not enter my obscure dwelling, if the sacred writers will enter and take up their abode under my roof, I shall not pine for want of intellectual companionship, and I may become a cultivated man, though excluded from what is called the best society in the place where I live. Reading the sacred writers, reading Shakespeare, becomes then, in this sense, in the 19th century, a universal act, meaning universal here, democratic. Reading as a universal act is endowed with an ethical nature that in Hoskins' speech combines with the religiosity that he borrows from Ritchie's conception of Shakespeare's drama and the universal essence of art. The religious discourse that underlies the construction of the concept of universality is imbricated with an ethical understanding of Shakespeare as a site for social encounter, not of cultural dominance. The religious nature that is attached to the concept universal Shakespeare goes beyond the fact that the author is presented as a literary god that is globally revered and Stratford as the shrine that pilgrims visit to pay homage to his memory. The concept of universality is understood here in broader but connected spiritual and ethical terms. The divinity that inhabits Shakespeare's works was thought in the 19th century to imply a movement away from sectarianism and fanaticism. They were therefore universal in their rejection of dogmatic intolerance and division. This particular understanding of the idea of an universal Shakespeare might have functioned as a reminder of how to face the religious conflicts within the church at the time. But it should also work for us today, irrespective of our religious or spiritual beliefs, as an ethical reminder of how all social conflicts should be resolved at any time, with tolerance and respect for difference. And I will finish my presentation with the fourth part that, as I said before, I will call the celebration. On October the 24th, 2025, a few months ago, in the chapel of San Ildefonso in Alcalá de Henares, a unique and unprecedented event took place in Spain as a result of a collaboration between the Universidad de Alcalá and the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia. The work of William Shakespeare entered into dialogue in the city of Cervantes with biblical texts within the framework of the Western Christian liturgy. The occasion was the presentation of the Liturgy of the Tempest, Facing the Storm with Love, which was written by Dr. Paul Fires, professor of systematic theology at the University of Oxford. This liturgy of the Tempest was first presented in the UK in April 2025. The Reverend Dr. Fides officiated the liturgy in Alcalá de Henares. That liturgy was translated into Spanish by Professor Antonio Ballesteros from the UNED and was presented by teachers and students from the UNED's Foreign Languages Department, accompanied by the early music consort of the Escuela de Canal in Madrid, and the magnificent voice of our colleague Eva Estebas, also from the UNED. A central part of the liturgy consists of poems inspired by The Tempest, written by Christopher Southgate. Southgate delighted those gathered in the chapel of San Ildefonso with his recitation of the poems. Graham Holderness and Paul Edmondson, reputed Shakespeareans and Church of England clergymen, were invited to participate and read passages from the Gospel of Matthew and the second letter of the Corinthians. Paul Field's liturgy on the Tempest is the ultimate illustration of a Shakespearean religious afterlife that conveys the message that adversity must be faced with the strength and vigor that come only from the love achieved through forgiveness, compassion, and reconciliation, which are central themes in The Tempest. The fully active participation of the almost 200 people who attended the presentation of the liturgy in Alcalá de Henares was an example of how Shakespeare's text, in communion with the sacred texts and Southgate's poetic work, inspired in many participants a sense of collectiveness that was evident from the very beginning of the ceremony. The impact that this event has had on those who took part was very significant. The Spanish performance of the Tempest liturgy was a demonstration of the immense artistic potential of Shakespeare's work and his power to evoke across nations and cultures a universal ethical message of mutual understanding and benevolence, to stimulate reflection on indifference toward the suffering of the most vulnerable, and to foster empathy for the pain of others and tolerance towards different beliefs and worldviews. In short, in many ways, it encapsulated a great deal of what this presentation has regarded as Shakespeare as a universal author. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. It was a privilege to have you here. Your lecture was enlightening, and thank you very much for the rehabilitation of the word universal. It's quite unfortunate that universal. Can you hear me? It is quite unfortunate that the word universality has come to mean colonial superiority or cultural superiority.
Erika, I can't hear you.
I don't know why. I haven't done anything.
Oh, no.
Yeah?
Yeah, no, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Sorry about this.
So I was saying that, in fact, the universal is an identification across cultures and across time. If Homer means something to us today, is because we can identify with him. And in that sense, it is more than democratic. It is just an invitation to everyone.
Yeah, that's democratic in that sense, I know.
And I don't know, now we have a time for, I mean, in the first minutes, which you couldn't hear, I was very grateful because you accepted our invitation. We don't have many Renaissance scholars who lecture in our series. And I was thanking you for this very illuminating lecture that you have given on Shakespeare. So now this is a time for questions. If any of you have questions, just go just go ahead and formulate them. Well, if nobody has, or if you are too shy to speak
Well,
up.
I'm really grateful of your presence. Anyway.
I have some questions because you were talking about Shakespeare's universality. There is a book by Jan Kott, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary,
Yeah.
and it shows how the texts of Shakespeare are how should I say this? A text that dismantles a totalitarian ideology. And Shakespeare was somehow a banner of hope and freedom for many of those who lived beyond the Iron Curtain. Also, UNESCO has reinterpreted Shakespeare's Macbeth and readapted him to, interpreted him as an example of totalitarian modern violence of an ideologue. And I wonder, one question, this is really my question to you. Do you think Shakespeare was Catholic?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a whole debate about whether he was a Catholic.
We don't hear you. I think you have to take them off.
Okay.
When you
Yes,
speak.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. There's a whole debate about that, about whether he was a Catholic or whether he was a Protestant. The ambivalence of his works can point us to so many different directions. He I couldn't say whether he was a Catholic, whether he was a Protestant. If you read Graham Holderness' book, The Faith of William Shakespeare, you will be convinced that he was a Protestant. If you read some other books by other critics that consider that he was a Catholic, you will be convinced also, because there's so many different ways that you can read his plays. I mean, he made sure that nobody would know at the time. It was quite dangerous if he was a Catholic to make it clear. So his family, yes, there are some elements that could lead us towards that direction. But at the time, it was very, very dangerous just to show that you were Catholic. So we'll never know. There's a play by Ron Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, which is very interesting. It's called Shakespeare. And he tries to, in a way, through a play, argue that he was Catholic, although he had relations to Catholics at the time. Because but we'll never know, really. Now I have to go back to my mic, otherwise I won't hear. I'm sorry about this. I don't know why this is not working. Okay.
His father was a recusant.
No, I can't. I think it takes time for this to adapt.
His daughter Suzanne was a recusant, and he had friendships with Jesuits that ended up martyrs. Yeah. He was protected by a nobleman who was a Catholic. Then in his testament, those in charge of his heritage were Catholics. And this is what Ackroyd would say, Elizabeth Sala.
Yes, there are many authors that argue for that. But there are many others who argue for the contrary. By reading his plays, you couldn't tell. But it's true that with his family links and the links that he had with some of the Catholics led, for example, Ron Williams, as I said, to write that play about the connections with Jesuits, and he's quite convincing. But you know, I mean, I couldn't say whether he was a Catholic or a Protestant. It's a big debate. Yeah.
Okay, are there other questions? No, well then, we thank you again
Oh, thank you.
for
It's been a pleasure.
this enlightening lecture. It was a privilege to have you here, and we hope you will accept our invitation in the future.
Oh, it will be a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, shit. I have a question. I don't know if possible to